Alright, got that going. Okay, first thing I'm going to do real quick, and Caleb's reminded me that it's been a while since we've just quickly gone over past philosophers and remind you who they were. So I'm going to start with a quick recap of the 20 philosophers that we've covered so far. And if you're watching this online, you can just skip ahead to the timestamp that says Aristotle. Okay, so going back over all the philosophers really quick, just tell me what they did. Thales.
The one stuff.
The one stuff. The one stuff, what's the one stuff?
Water.
Water. So he's the one that starts asking this question. He's the father of philosophy. He starts asking, you know, you see things changing into other things. There must be one underlying substance that underlies everything. They must have something in common. So there must be this one stuff. He starts the search for the one stuff. He called the one stuff water. Then we got Anaximander. What did he do?
Was he the ether?
Close. A Pyrrhon. He's the Pyrrhon guy.
That's right.
He says it's the indefinite, the infinite, the boundless. That's the one stuff. But pretty much following Thales, his teacher, in the same type of philosophy. Then Anaximenes, a student of Anaximander, what did he say?
The one stuff was air.
He says the one stuff is air. He says, Master, you're cheating. You're saying this one stuff is this unknowable stuff. You're telling us nothing. It's got to be something if we're going to say it's something. And so he says it's air, and he thought that the whole universe was full of air. And he's the one that had the rarefication and condensation for how elements change into different elements. And then we had Xenophanes. He was kind of the weird one. He was a religious one. He was the one who mostly was given criticisms of Homer and Hesiod. But he said, to the extent that he said it was a one stuff, he said it was earth and water, and he thought it went through cycles of earth and water back and forth. But on top of that, he also seemed to imply that the all was God, and God was all, and the whole universe was God. So he had both those elements too. Okay, Heraclitus, probably, he's like one of the big three ones of the pre-Socratics. What did Heraclitus say?
No change.
Change. Change is the one stuff.
Sorry.
The quote for Heraclitus is, nothing is, everything is becoming. Nothing exists. This universe has no entities in it. Nothing is. What exists? Change. The process of change. That's what exists. Now some say he also said fire was the one stuff. Other people say fire, he was just using that as an analogy for change. Change is the one stuff, and that's how most people interpret it. Nothing in this universe exists. There's just change. No physical entities. He's the one who, by implication, denies the laws of logic. Change implies a contradiction. Obviously there's change, so there's no logic. There's no entities. There's no identity. That's Heraclitus. We can think about him as a forerunner of all the sophists and skeptics. If there's nothing, then nothing can be known, right? Okay, then we get Pythagoras. What did he say?
Numbers.
Numbers. Numbers are somehow the one stuff. Everything is composed of numbers. Somehow thought you get 10 ones together and you got this thing called a tetractys. And while ones might be viewed as somehow one-dimensional atoms, when you get 10 of them together, it actually has this tetrahedron shape in a tetractys, which can then start occupying physical space. And so somehow it builds up our universe. Not sure how exactly that process works, but somehow. Numbers. Everything is somehow numbers. And then we get to Parmenides. He's often seen as opposed to Heraclitus. What does Parmenides say?
No change.
There is no change. The whole universe is just a solid plenum of being, like a big giant concrete sphere. And it's timeless too. Experience is no time. All the change in time that we experience, illusions. We think that there's multiple entities. No, there's just the entity, the one, the being. That's what there is. Zeno, Parmenides' most famous student, he's famous for his paradoxes. He was just proving Parmenides right. They have the same philosophy. He just gave a bunch of arguments showing how, if you think Parmenides wrong, here's the absurdity you believe. You think it's possible for Achilles to pass the tortoise? How silly can you be? I'll show you how it's impossible. You think there's multiple entities? How silly can you be? I'll show you how it's impossible. His paradoxes. Showing how if you disagree with Parmenides, you get in just as ridiculous, you come to just as ridiculous conclusions as you think believing Parmenides leads you to believe. Anyways, then we got Melissus. He was just a one-page one. He pretty much follows Parmenides and Zeno. He just says that the one stuff, it's eternal rather than being timeless. It's not that it doesn't experience time, it's that it's experiencing an infinite amount of time. And then he gave a bunch of different arguments for the one, but his arguments were the ones that kept using the bad logic over and over again. We used him as our example of bad logic. He says, since alpha implies beta, then not alpha implies not beta. Bad logic. That's mostly what we used him for. All right, then we get Empedocles.
He was the one that tried to fuse Parmenides and Heraclitus, right?
Yeah, he's the first one bringing Parmenides and Heraclitus together. So he's the one that introduces the four elements: fire, water, earth, and air. He says the elements are eternal. They're like little Parmenidean things. And the whole universe is full of elements, so you don't get any empty space, like Parmenides seemed to show was impossible. But you can still get movement because they're just like swapping positions with each other. And so it's just fire, water, earth, and air, and everything's really just the right combinations of these things. Fire, water, earth, and air. And then we get Anaxagoras. Remember him? He's the one that says there's little seeds of everything in everything. He thought everything was in existence from the very beginning. There was banana stuff, there was tree stuff, there was mushroom stuff, there was that clock stuff. Every possible thing with every possible combination of qualitative properties was there in the beginning, just in different proportions around the universe. And so in the beginning there was a predominance of air. And so it seemed like everything was air, because that's what the ratio was. But as things start separating off, it creates all our different things. So his philosophy kind of reminds you a little bit of Anaximenes' philosophy in that everything's air. But rather than rarefication and condensation, it's like separating off of seeds that we start to get everything that we get. Now what he's more famous for is introducing nous, or mind, into philosophy. He's the first one to say, not only is it that this chain reaction of physical things causes motion in the universe, but minds are also capable of initiating motion in the universe. I don't have to wait for all these things to bounce around just perfectly for me to decide to get up and start moving. I have that act within me because I have a mind. Minds are what are capable of initiating action and knowing things. He introduces that distinction. Then we get to Leucippus. Remember him? He's the father of the atomic theory. All that exists are atoms in the void. So Leucippus and Democritus, we pretty much attribute them as having the exact same philosophy. What's the intuition for their philosophy? Take Parmenides 1, stick it in the void, and take a sledgehammer to it. And all those little pieces of being floating around in the void, those are your atoms. Little timeless, solid pieces of being that don't experience any change internally, but randomly bounce around in the universe, creating the universe that we see today. So that's Democritus and Leucippus. Diogenes of Apollonia, not the Diogenes that's the more famous one. He was another one-page philosopher, probably don't remember him. All he really did is he kind of restated Anaximenes' philosophy, but giving it Anaxagoras' nous. Says everything's there, give it mind. And then we get to our sophists. The first of our sophists, Protagoras. Remember what Protagoras is famous for? The quote associated with him? It's the man one.
Sorry.
Man is the measure.
Yeah.
Man is the measure of all things. Of things that are, that they are. Of things that are not, that they are not. How is the universe actually? However man observes it to be. However you personally measure it to be. Give you the Shakespeare version. There is no good or evil, but thinking makes it so. It's only because men think something's evil that something's actually evil. It's not inherently evil. It's not inherently good. Man is the measure. That stick stuck in the water, it may be bent for you, but as I'm feeling it, it's not bent for me. Who's right, who's wrong? Man's the measure. It's bent for you, it's not bent for me. Then we get Gorgias, our most famous skeptic.
Nothing can be known.
First, nothing exists.
Nothing exists. That's right.
Even if it exists, you can't know anything about it. Even if you couldn't communicate anything about it. So there's no sense talking about it. So, most famous, and then these two were smaller ones. Prodicus, probably don't remember much about him.
The
So,
Magnus, right? One or
no, that was Thrasymachus.
Okay.
So Prodicus, remember the other thing that the sophists are doing, they're training you how to speak. That's what they're really focused on, is rhetoric, getting other people to see your position. So he focuses on words, the etymology of words, and in particular on the right, connotation of the words. Make sure when you're constructing your speeches, pick the word with the right connotation. It's not enough to get the one with the right definition. You also need that right connotation. You want to get this emotional experience in your audience as well, not just communicate the facts to it. And then Thrasymachus, he's the one who perfected the hand gestures. But he's most famous for developing or for giving us a sophist view when it comes to political matters, which is that might makes right. The sophists in general say, what's good? satisfying your arbitrary desires. And so what happens when your desires and my desires come into conflict? Who's right? Whoever has a bigger stick. To give you his exact definition, justice is the interest of the stronger. If I'm stronger than you, justice is my interest, not yours. Too bad. And then finally we get to Socrates, who I assume we're all familiar with now. But what's Socrates known for?
The absolute good, true, and beautiful.
The search for the good, the true, and the beautiful. They are objective, they are absolute. We can come to know these things. Now, he didn't think anyone knew these things, but he thought it was possible to come to know these things. So he would, through the Socratic method, point out to people over and over again, you don't really know what you're talking about. Some sophists claim to have a definition of justice. He shows them how they have an incoherent definition of justice. And he did that with all these concepts over and over again. Because he was curious, why is everyone collapsing into skepticism? His conclusion was, they don't know what they're talking about. They have no coherent definition of these concepts that they're talking about. And so I just need to show them that. You need to go find the right definitions before you start having these conversations. So we also introduced the need we have for definitions. And all definitions are about universals. We don't define Donnie, we define man. We don't define my cat Bob, we define cat. All definitions have to do with universals. And so if we can find definitions for universals, we can start talking about universal knowledge, things that we can all agree on. And then finally, Plato. Plato following his master Socrates in the search for the good, the true, and the beautiful, but now for the first time, we get an entire system of philosophy constructed. He talked about the metaphysics, the epistemology, the politics, the ethics, the aesthetics, all tied together in a way to vindicate this belief in the good, the true, and the beautiful, and he piggybacked on Socrates' philosophy, or on his ethics, which was pretty much a standard Greek ethics for the time. Be just, be wise, be courageous, be temperate. Okay, so that's a quick run through the 20. Any questions before we get back to where we were with Aristotle? All right. So we already went over his life. We're going to jump now straight into Aristotle's philosophy. Now remember, Aristotle is following. That's a bad piece of chalk. Aristotle is following his master Plato with this system knowledge, or with the system model. He loves the system model. So he's still following Socrates. I meant to say Plato there. I guess it still works for Socrates. Still following Socrates or Plato in his pursuit for the good, the true, and the beautiful. And so he's going to build out a system that does this. He's going to piggyback on Plato's system model. So he wants to build out a full system of philosophy. And I want to give you a high-level view for what that is. So his system is split up into the Organon. The Organon is going to be the study of how we do study. It's sometimes referred to as the science of science. It's a study of how you build systems. It's the study of systematic bodies of knowledge. And in the Organon is where we're going to go over logic. And then you have theoretical philosophy, practical philosophy, and productive philosophy. Let me try and draw out a picture here to give you a high-level view for his philosophy. So first off, you have his Organon, which is relevant to every field. Organon roughly translates to instrument, the instrument of learning. And then we have, we'll call it theoretical. We're going to run out of space if I write it all the way. We have theo for theoretical philosophy, practical for practical philosophy, and then prod for productive philosophy. So these are our three major branches of philosophy according to Aristotle. In theoretical philosophy, we are interested in what is true. We want to know what is or is not true. In practical philosophy, we are interested in the good. What's the good thing to do? What's the bad thing to do? What's the right thing to do? What's the wrong thing to do? In productive philosophy, we're interested in beauty. Theoretical philosophy is focused on what you can know. Practical philosophy is focused on what you can do. Productive philosophy is focused on what you can make. Under theoretical philosophy, his first major field that he has is metaphysics. Metaphysics, which is the study of being. Under that, he then puts math. And then under that, he now puts natural philosophy. Starting with physics. But he goes on physics, biology, etc. And if you draw these out like this. So those are the different theoretical philosophies and the different fields of theoretical philosophy. Over in practical philosophy, we have ethics, we have politics, and then we have economics. These are the different fields of philosophy where you focus on the actions you can take. Whether you should or should not steal that thing. Which policies we should or should not instate. Should you or should you not buy that car? And then finally, productive philosophy, focused on the things you can make. His two major works over here are the Poetics and then his Rhetoric. Rhetoric, is that RH?
Yeah.
Why does it feel weird when I'm writing it?
No, that's right.
I don't know why it felt weird. Rhetoric. And so these are his two major fields focus on what you can do as a maker, things you can make. Now poetics here is more general than just building poetry. This is creating physical things in a well-done way, and then rhetoric is creating well-made speeches. So these have to do with what you make, these have to do with how you act, these have to do with what you can know. Go ahead.
Why is it called productive?
Because you actually produce something, a physical entity. So over here, this is what Aristotle, when he's talking about science, he uses the word science to refer to anything in this column. This all has to do with science. Everything over in this column, we call an art, where you produce artifacts, artificial things, things that do not show up in nature. Building a school, masonry, that's an art. Plumbing, that's an art. Working as an electrician, that's an art. Working as an archer, horseback riding. Over here, we're focused on actual actions, ethical actions. Should I do this or should I not do this? Over here, you develop skill or technique. Over here, you develop good habits. Over here, you develop knowledge. And then again, the organon is part of everything. The organon is how you develop these systematic bodies of knowledge. It's the rules for developing systematic bodies of knowledge. And the organon is where we talk about logic. That's why logic is completely universal. You can always use logic. Doesn't matter if you're in a math class, or whether you're in a history class, or whether you're coming up with an interpretation for a poem. You're always allowed to use logic. It's universally applicable. So, I think I covered all this. Theoretical philosophy, what do we have there? We have metaphysics, mathematics, and natural philosophy. Focused on truth, that's the end of it. It's targeting at the things that you can know. Here, we do derivation to come to conclusions. In the sciences, you always start with your premises and you show that your premises until your conclusion. Derivation is what we mean like what you do in a math class. You might think of it as proof. Same thing as proof here. Those are that's theoretical philosophy. Practical philosophy, ethics, politics, and economics, focus on good, doing the things that you can do. You can do good things. The conclusions we come to here, we come to through deliberation. You deliberate over whether you should do this or whether you should do that. You don't start with some premises that you accept as true to come to some conclusion. You say, what if we want this? Well, then there's this conclusion. Well, what if we want this? Well, there's this conclusion. Well, which of those is better? Like a weighing of your options here. And then finally, productive philosophy, poetics and rhetoric, focus on beauty, making. Here you develop technique. Use technique to get your end result. So in the sciences, we derive our end results. In practical philosophy, we deliberate as to what we should do. In the arts, we use a technique to derive what we should do. And these we call sciences, these we call arts. In the practical, here in the middle, sometimes we call it a science, sometimes we call it an art. It goes back and forth. He typically refers to politics as the chief art. Okay, so that's the map of his philosophy at a high level view. Any questions about the map of his philosophy?
Why does he have less stuff in Organon philosophy than the rest?
These things that I have listed out aren't necessarily how much he has. So in natural philosophy, he has tons of different works.
Okay.
So he has a work called Physics down here. He has works on biology, works on the soul. So this column by far is the one he has the most in.
So the Organon is believed to be a complete, what do you call it, of philosophy, or a complete, what you saying?
It's the Organon is one way to say it is it's the science of sciences. It's what you need to know to develop fields of knowledge. And so in the Organon, we're going to focus on language and logic and basic facts of the universe. Kind of those three things together.
Right, and I was just, okay, so we said that Plato was the first one to complete, what?
He's the first one to have a systematic philosophy.
So it wasn't necessarily considered whole or complete, it was just a systematic.
I mean, it was all related to each other.
Is that what that systematic means, is that they were all related to each other?
Yeah, they were all part of the same one system. So for example, if you go back to the atomists, they had a metaphysics and they had an ethics. The two had nothing to do with each other. They were completely unrelated from each other. Their metaphysics said you're just chemicals in motion, choice is an illusion. Their ethics focused around you need to make better choices. And there's no way to glue those two things together.
So in this case, the three categories,
Yes.
they are connected. Is that correct? In this body of knowledge?
They are connected. I mean, they're focused at three different things. The Organon tells us what is common to all these things. So whatever we talk about in the Organon, the conclusions that we come to there, we can use here, we can use here, we can use here. When you're constructing a speech, you can use logic. When you're coming up with a derivation of the Pythagorean theorem, you can use logic. When you're deciding whether or not to buy that car, you can use logic. Logic doesn't belong to just one of these things.
And that's
It's more
what he
general
means
than
by
that.
having a whole set or system of knowledge, or last week we said.
Systematic.
Systematic body of knowledge is what you mean by that is that they're all fundamentally built on the Organon, which is basically logic.
No, I just mean that they all work together and they all don't contradict each other. They all complement each other in one big system. He happens to have this Organon wrapped around it. Plato didn't have his Organon wrapped around it. But everything in Plato, for example, comes back to his theory of the forms. So because he has the metaphysics that he does, then he has the epistemology that he does, and so he has the ethics that he does, and so he has the politics that he does, etc. And so it was all focused around his theory of the forms, and that's what tied everything together in that. I mean, in a way, I guess you could say his Organon ties everything together, but we're also going to see that really his metaphysics kind of ties everything together. When something ties everything together, it ultimately needs to be your metaphysics, pretty much.
Right.
Your view of existence as a whole is what ties everything in existence together.
Yes.
Sometimes the way it's summarized is, not on this, sorry. Metaphysics focuses on what exists. Epistemology, how do you know? And then the rest of philosophy, so what? What are the consequences of those things? And that's how they're tied together in a system.
Well, I'm just trying to understand what a systematic body of knowledge really means, and one of the earmarks that I'm getting from this is that it can't have contradictions.
It definitely can't contradict itself. Typically, I mean, in the strictest sense of the word, with how we use it now, it means some sort of axiomatic system. From these basic premises, you construct this thing that is completely self-consistent.
Okay, and Plato, in more modern terms, was the first to come up with an axiomatic system that connected all of these branches of thought.
It's not completely rigorous, but yeah, he had his basic assumptions that he used to build his whole system. He said, here's my few assumptions, and now from that I build out my metaphysics, from that I build out my epistemology, etc.
Yeah,
Okay, so all coherent with itself. all built off the same premises. Any other questions about the high-level map? Okay, so there's a map of what he's going to do. Now, let's briefly talk about how he differs from Plato. Can you erase some of that? So while he follows Plato's basic outline for systematic bodies of knowledge, he's still going to develop his metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, aesthetics, let they all tie together. He is entirely opposed to Plato's basic premise, and hence the world of forms. So let's really quick try to get Plato's basic thought to the world of forms, quick outline of it. What does Plato say? He starts out with, reality is knowable. That's a basic premise. What's known? Universals. So reality is what's knowable. What's knowable are universals. Therefore, universals exist as a part of reality. They must. This world contains particulars and not universals. I see a man, I see a man, I see a man. I can't find manness here in this universe. So there must exist a separate world of forms, which is the real reality. This world isn't real, but just a shadow of reality, and so we can know nothing about this world. We can have opinion at best. That all sound familiar? So what does Aristotle say? He says this is ridiculous. The basic facts that we have are of this world. So he says reality exists independent of us. Plato, you're sitting here saying reality has to be something that we can know. Somehow reality has to conform to people. He says no. First off, reality exists independent of us. And we just happen to be part of reality. It's in no way dependent upon us. If we can know it or if we can't, that has nothing to do with what reality is. So reality exists independent of us. We happen to be part of reality. We possess a soul which enables us to be conscious of and reason about reality. So here we are, we exist in reality, we got this soul thing, which enables us to get the sensory data and to think and reason about this reality that we're a part of. Our senses communicate facts of reality to our soul, ultimately. And if facts of reality don't agree with our theory, then we throw the theory out, not the facts. What does Plato say? Here's my great theory, therefore throw all the facts out. Can't know anything about this world. Can't know any of those basic facts. Aristotle says, how backwards? You have to start with those basic facts to develop your theory. Reality is pretty much how our senses and reason tell us it is, composed of these individual things that act and behave the way that we see them acting and behaving. You didn't think that's impossible for you to come to a wrong conclusion based off your sensory data, but in general, your senses aren't lying to you. If it looks like Achilles passes the tortoise, Achilles passes the tortoise. I don't care what your clever argument says, that's a basic fact. Whatever your clever argument is, it's based in a wrong, it's somehow wrong. We start with the basic facts of reality, and then we develop theories based on those facts. So that's the basic way, give you a high-level view of the difference between them. So, since he's going to start from scratch, how does he do away with Plato's whole philosophy? What was his basic argument against Plato's forms? Now, he's going to come at this in a very typical Aristotle way. Aristotle typically goes along the lines of, even if you're right, it's pointless, but here's how you're wrong. So here's even if you're right, it's pointless part of Aristotle. Even if the forms are real, they tell us absolutely nothing. What can I come to know about all these shoes? They participate in shoeness. Oh, thank you, Plato. I'm so well informed now. How much I know. You've told me nothing. How do they participate in shoeness? How does that shoeness relate to these shoes here? Oh, well, it projects itself into the void. What does that mean? Oh, well, it's just an analogy. Quit with the analogies. Quit with the metaphors. Tell me what you mean. How does my shoe participate in shoeness? Furthermore, what do I care about? If I'm a cobbler, I don't care about shoeness. I care about shoes. You're telling me, even if I got shoeness, this world's unknowable. Who's on the other side? So it in no way helps me. So even if the forms are real, they tell us nothing. Plato says a shoe participates in shoeness, whatever that means, but it's completely unclear what this relationship is. Plato largely relies on metaphors without making explicit how this actually works. There's the world of forms, this world, but how are they really connected? Plato only gives us analogies. Furthermore, since this world is unknowable, how do they help? So even if you're right, who cares? It's pointless. You're not helping in any way. But you're wrong. Here's how you're wrong. So first off, what does Plato say? He says, we look at all these individual things, we recognize similarities between them. Since we can recognize similarities, there must have been a universal in the world of forms representing those similarities that we knew before, and now it's triggering our memory. So in other words, the forms are meant to capture similarities. If you can find similarities between objects, there must be a form capturing those similarities that we knew in the world of forms before we came here. So the forms are meant to capture similarities. Now the word dog applies to multiple similar animals. So we know there must be a dogness. And so there must be the form dogness. However, don't dogness and my dog Bob have something in common? Aren't they somehow similar? Yeah. So then there must be a form relating those two together. And you might call that the third dog argument. Plato was the first one to make this own criticism of his theory in the Parmenides. We call it the third man argument. He says, well, me and madness must have something in common, and so now there must be this third madness out there somewhere. And now me and this third madness must have something in common, so there must be this fourth madness. And so the theory completely blows up. If so, there must be some other universal da-da-da-da-da. Hence we get an infinite regression of forms. So that's one argument against it. Second argument against it, that was real common. Aristotle says the forms are self-contradictory. How so? Plato says that since the universal men is knowable as such, then there must be some form manness. Right? As a particular thing. Thus, the universal exists as a particular form in the world of forms. What is a universal? I mean, what's the opposite of a particular? A universal. These things are opposites. And yet he's turning a universal into a particular. And so each universal is really a particular entity. Contradiction. You're turning universals into particulars. You're saying universals exist as particulars. Somewhere else, who cares? You're saying universals are particulars. No, particulars are particulars and universals are universals. You see the contradiction? I'm giving you very condensed versions of these, just walking through the intuition of it. But that's roughly how the argument goes. So, thus Aristotle is out to do what Plato did, to demonstrate that there is objective and absolute good, truth, and beauty, and to do so in a way that resolves Parmenides and Heraclitus. Remember, we still have to deal with these two. We need to set up our universe, which allows for both logic and change. He wants a complete system of philosophy, except he wants to construct it without any use of metaphors, and without any reference to things beyond our actual experience. How do we come to know things? Oh, in a life that you can't remember, you knew everything and now you're recollecting it. How the heck do we validate that? So we're only going to make references to our own experiences, and we're going to explain everything without use of metaphors. No metaphors, no allegory in the cave. We got to be able to explain everything, otherwise we don't know it. We want to know. So with that, we're ready to jump into his Organon, almost. Any questions so far, high level, before we start jumping in?
Second slide back. It was kind of interesting. I just, not this one. Should see. What the heck was I going to bring up? Oh, you were saying that Aristotle looked at things like, basically saying if there's logic that contradicts reality, then you probably should throw that logic out if the facts.
If your theory runs contrary to the basic facts around us,
Yes.
you throw your theory out, not the facts. What would all these guys say? I've done a lot of studying, and according to all my studying, when I let the skulls get hover in the air, that must be an illusion.
Based off
The facts are wrong because my theory says it should be otherwise.
Yeah, because the logic implied that it
Right, so I did some fancy derivation, who knows?
Yeah.
Right? That's why I started out this class with that proof that 1's equal to -1. You can be clever to show absurd things. Doesn't make it true.
Right, so a lot of the time people were using logic to come up with these most absurd terms, and then
That's what everyone prior to Aristotle was doing. They thought that they were just following the argument. They start from the basic premises, follow some argument, leads to some conclusion. The conclusion is absolutely asinine, but they say, I can't see what's wrong with my work. This must be a loop. And this doesn't die out after these early guys. This is modern philosophy all over the place.
So it's still today.
Still today. It's completely rampant in the majority of philosophy. Very few people are Aristotelian. The vast majority of philosophies are opposed to this.
Really?
Yes. I mean, one of the more famous ones, David Hume. He thought that the whole world must exist in his mind somehow. One story says he convinced himself so well he tried to walk through a rock, convinced that it really just exists in his mind. He walks into the rock. Well, that didn't work. He says something to the effect of, I see my philosophy, and then I go out and experience real life. And everything I was writing down before seems completely asinine. Then I come back and look at my philosophy, I can't figure out what I did wrong. So my philosophy must be true. And there's no saying, you go out there and all these facts tell you you're wrong, and you're so arrogant as to believe you couldn't have made a mistake here. Drives him nuts. So all the philosophers before him do it, the vast majority of philosophers after him do it. This is very common in philosophy. Ignoring the basic facts. Okay. So we're going to get into his Organon. But before that, I know that I put metaphysics right here. But metaphysics also kind of exists as a package over everything, because everything comes under metaphysics.
Is his Organon a published work, or is it just lecture notes?
Sorry, lecture notes. I thought you meant, could you read it?
No, you
So-
can't read it, it's a book.
What we have of Aristotle's published, and you can go read it all, is why I meant to say that. But no, we do not have any of Aristotle's works that he published for the public.
How did we get the name Organon?
So a bunch of these names come by just the accidents of history. For example, why does metaphysics have its name? Because the guy who found it after he found the physics. And so it's what came after the physics. Aristotle called this first philosophy. So a bunch of the naming is just an accident of history how the names come out.
So Aristotle did not name the Organon the Organon?
No,
Gotcha.
because they're just notes. I mean, your class notes, you don't say, I'm calling these collection of notes. We know that he says, as he's talking about this first science, da-da-da-da-da, or in the physics, in doing physics, da-da-da-da-da. So sometimes he accidentally makes reference to what it is he's talking about, but a lot of it is just our naming. And so the Organon somehow, at the time, meant the instrument for doing philosophy, is what they're thinking there.
Okay.
Okay, so we're going to do the Organon, but we need to know, just in the broadest sense, what his metaphysics is. So we're just going to touch on it a little bit, do the Organon, then get into metaphysics proper. Because metaphysics is about everything. So, a couple key things to Aristotle's metaphysics is, first off, what ultimately exists are individual, particular substances. You, me, that chair, that garbage can, that desk. Not forms. Individual, particular things are fundamentally what exists in this universe. To the extent that forms exist, they exist in particulars. Where does chairness exist? It exists in that chair, and that chair, and that chair, and that chair, and that chair. That's where chairness exists. And we'll cover this when we talk to you about his theory of the soul, but it also exists in your mind. And it says, the same way that your body is built so that you can take matter into it, your mind is so built as it can take forms into it. So you can see what those chairs have in common. The form goes into your mind. You become informed. That's where you're going to see roots for a lot of concepts that we have in Aristotle. That's what informed means. You take the forms in of something. So where do forms exist? In particular objects in your mind, but you are also a particular object. That's where they exist. Not somewhere da-da-da-da-da. They're right here. So what ultimately and fundamentally exists are individual particular things. If I got rid of every individual particular thing in existence, I would be left with nothing. Okay. Now, he does not think that everything that exists are physical entities. So I'm going to draw, here's existence, and then here's the physical universe. Now this is not to say that I can walk outside the physical universe into existence somewhere. That's just saying of all the things that exist, some of them are physical entities, some of them are not. We have, metaphysics is about existence, physics is about the physical universe. It's about physical entities. Metaphysics is more broad than that. It's about anything that exists. When you're in a physics class, you are studying the laws of, he also calls this natural science, nature, laws of nature, laws of physics, same thing. You talk about the laws of nature, the laws that govern physical objects, physical entities, physical interactions. More broad than that are the laws of metaphysics. These are laws that not only are all physical entities subject to, but everything is subject to. So Newtonian, obviously Newton's way after him, but Newtonian laws govern this. More fundamental than that are metaphysical laws that govern existence as such. Now for him, the laws of logic are metaphysical laws.
Are they the only metaphysical laws?
They're the only ones that I can think that he makes explicit reference to. This one kind of by implication. But these for him are metaphysical laws, more foundational than physical laws. And he says for these laws, we cannot help but accept them as true. You cannot prove these metaphysical laws. There's no such thing as a proof for him. It's more foundational than that. They are the laws that govern proof. They're so foundational, you can't help but accept them. I'll give you a really quick way that he explains how you can't help but accept the law of contradiction. Well, maybe briefly state what each of these are, and then we'll do that. So, if you were to Google the laws of physics or Aristotle's laws of physics, you'd see these three things. So number one, law of contradiction. What does this say? It says contradictory propositions cannot both be true in the same sense at the same time. In other words, you cannot have alpha and not alpha. I cannot ever have it be that the sky's blue and the sky's not blue. If I say the sky's blue and you say no it's not, you're saying the sky's not blue. One of those always has to be true, one of them always has to be false, the law of contradiction. It is not the case that you can have alpha and not alpha. Or in other words, this is a tautology, the whole thing. It's always true. That's the law of contradiction. Law of excluded middle. This says either a proposition or its negation is true. In other words, sorry, I should have made thought that wasn't on this line. Alpha or not alpha is always true. Teacher gives you a test, and they say, what's x? You say x is 6 or it's not 6. Tell me I'm wrong, teacher. Law of excluded middle. And then finally, the law of identity. Everything is identical with itself. It's often stated as A is A, or A equals A. Stated more explicitly, for all x, x is identical with itself. Everything is identical with itself. So those are the three laws of logic. Now what does Aristotle mean that you can't help but accept them? I'll walk you through one of the ways that he explains this. He calls it affirmation by denial. He's saying, look, if you accept it as true, you accept it as true. If you don't accept it as true, you still accept it as true. Even by denying it, you can't help but accept it. And he walks you through, I'll give you one not as sophisticated as his, but it'll give you the idea. You say, Aristotle, I don't believe you. The law of contradiction, it's not true. Aristotle says, wonderful. I'm glad you agree with the law of contradiction. We're agreed it's true. You say, no, I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying it's not true. I say, fantastic. You think it's true. What's wrong with you, Aristotle? I'm saying it's not true. So it can't be true. Law of contradiction. If it's not true, you can't have it both be true and not true. So you have to use the law of contradiction to deny the law of contradiction. That's what he means. It's more foundational than we have some proof for it. These are things that you can't help but accept as true. That's how he views it. That make sense?
It seems like he could use the same logical contradictions that he brought towards Plato's beliefs as far as the world of forms to this world of existence outside of the natural universe?
Well, this isn't outside of the natural universe in the sense that you can go outside the natural universe.
I don't mean physically, or like distance-wise.
For give you an example of something that exists here, your mind. Your mind, for him, is not a physical entity. Give you something Aristotle would say. You don't think with your brain, but you can't think without it. Having a brain is a necessary condition for thinking. It's not a sufficient condition for thinking. I can't just get a brain and have it start thinking.
He's talking about consciousness.
He would call it your mind, but yes.
Yeah, right.
It's not a physical thing.
Holy Spirit,
It's just that I don't know how.
Give you something not so ethereal like that. He says chairness exists,
in every chair.
but it's not a physical thing. It exists in the physical things, but it's not a physical thing. He would say Newton's laws, if you knew them, they exist. And so even Newton's laws are subject to these metaphysical laws. You cannot come up with laws of physics that deny the law of contradiction. I say, according to my theory of gravity, this will hover. Did it hover? Well, I don't accept the law of contradiction, so no, that doesn't disprove my theory. You say that contradicts your theory. I don't accept the law of contradiction. Even our laws are subject to these metaphysical laws. Everything is. So everything from physical objects to your laws of physics. So there's non-physical things. They still exist in physical things. But not everything that we're talking about is a physical entity. That's what I mean. This isn't outside our physical universe somehow. It's just classifying types of things.
I'm just saying, like, for instance, our mind, consciousness, let's say, hypothetically, his argument against Plato was, look, you can't even prove that this exists. There's no way to analyze, measure it, determine it.
There's no way to experience it, yeah.
Yeah, no way to experience it. And so, I feel like that same reasoning and logic you could use against this existence plane where the laws of logic apply, maybe mathematics, geometry, things where that you can't describe the triangle in the physical universe, but we can describe out its existence, right? And I'm just saying, look, you can't really measure. You can't really.
Whoa. We're not talking about can you measure it or can't you measure it.
Yes, but my point
Look,
is just making it up.
consciousness, for example. You have direct experience of your conscious all the time. That's something you have a direct experience of. Just because you can't measure it doesn't mean you don't have an experience of it.
Okay.
You have direct experience of pain.
Yeah, but just because we can't measure it, just because we're experiencing it.
He didn't say, listen, Plato, we're only going to talk about things that we can measure. He says, we're only going to talk about things that we have direct experience of. You have direct experience of these things.
I'm just saying, just because we can't figure out where it fits into the physical universe and natural laws, doesn't necessarily mean it's not where it exists.
Right.
And I'm just comparing.
Aristotle doesn't disagree with that.
Okay. Oh.
Aristotle says, where does chairness exist? In chairs. And then in your mind. We'll do more with your mind later when we get to Hysteria on the Soul. But it exists here. That's what I was trying to say. This doesn't mean you go walk outside this universe, according to him, and open a door and walk into existence.
Well, yeah.
It's just classification of types of things.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll think about it some more.
Okay, so with that, we're going to jump to the Organon. Organon broken up into 6 separate pieces. First, we have his categories. His categories are classifying basic concepts. Here we're classifying individual, I almost want to say words, but sometimes it can be a couple words to represent one concept. For example, in room 5. That represents a single place. I can say here, or I can say in room 5. Those are like the same concept. One uses a bunch of words, one uses one word. So it's not classifying words, but more like classifying simple ideas. Simple ideas, simple language. On interpretation now is where we're going to start talking about entire sentences, propositions. So here we're talking about the pieces of propositions, the individual language that we use to build up propositions. Here we're going to actually start talking about propositions, statements that are either true or false. And then his prior analytics, this is where he does most of his logic. This is where we're going to talk about how we can combine statements together to come to new true statements. I can take two true statements, combine them together in a fancy way that gives me this new true statement. If I know that all men are mortal, I know Socrates is a man, I know Socrates is mortal. It's a completely new statement that somehow spits out of those. It's amazing, this process. And it's a process that goes through all of geometry. You take your 5 postulates, and out of that, all the theorems spit out somehow. And it's a matter of just lining them up in the right way. It's crazy. So this is talking about the individual concepts, somewhat the individual words. This is talking about the individual propositions. This is talking about combining propositions together to get new propositions. Here, his posterior analytics, this is focused on now science. It's the first outline of how we do science, kind of like how we talk about science today. His topics, here's where he talks a lot about definition. Here's where he talks a bit about deliberation, or the dialectic method for coming to know things. And then on physical refutations, here's where he spends a lot of time giving you helpful hints for being in an argument. He views this particularly the way that they do in Plato's dialogues, where you're either the one asking the questions or answering the questions. So he's like giving you advice, if you're the one asking the questions, da-da-da-da-da-da. If you're the one answering the questions, da-da-da-da-da. Here's things to do, watch out for, general rules. Of these, we're going to focus mostly on the first 4. That's what we're interested in. High level Organon makes sense, and hopefully the general flow of it. See the logical order to it? Okay, with that, we're ready to jump into the Organon proper. How does he start out with? He introduces this concept of univocal versus equivocal. What does it mean when we use a word in a univocal way? Univocal, same word and definition. When I say that you and I are a man, I'm using that in a univocal way. Equivocal, same word but different definitions. I say I'm a man, I say look at this man. Aristotle says no. You're using the same word in 2 different ways. Remember, we're building up our rules now for building these bodies of knowledge. Building up our rules for if you're going to build a systematic body of knowledge, here's one of the things you got to do. You've got to use your language univocally, not equivocally. A bunch of the past philosophers, they cheated this way by using the same word to have 2 different meanings. Give you one example. One of the arguments we've already come across, cut down. He says, the universe is eternal, meaning never-ending in time. From the universe is eternal, this isn't Aristotle, this is a past argument we've looked at. This came from Melissus, if you can. Okay, what did he say? He said the universe is eternal, and since it's eternal, then the universe is infinite, right? If it's eternal, it's infinite. Makes perfect sense. Well, if it's infinite, then it's boundless. Right? What's boundless if not infinity? And if it's boundless, then it's infinitely large. If you were boundless, you must be infinitely large, right? And so we just got an argument from the universe is infinite in time to the universe is infinite in space. And how did we do that? We were equivocal in our usage of infinite. In one sense, we meant infinite in time. In another sense, we meant infinite in space. So one of the ways that we're building these bad arguments is we allow ourselves to use equivocal versus univocal language. We have to use univocal language. So when we come up with our definitions in our science, like if you, for example, are reading a chemistry book and it gives you a definition of some word, it has to always use that word the same way. It has to use it in a univocal way. Now he says this doesn't mean that we have to go around defining every term we come across. We can have what we call derived terms. So a derivative term, typically by adding a suffix or a prefix to a predefined word. For example, if you've already defined the word right, you don't need to find rewrite. If you've already defined the word care, you don't need to find careless. If you've already defined the word honest, you don't need to go and define dishonest, honestly, or unhonest. Those are derived terms you get for free. So you're setting up your systematic body of knowledge. You need to define your terms, but you don't have to define it in every sense that you're going to use it. You get derived terms for free. Pretty straightforward stuff. All right, simple language. That is language void of composition or structure. Simple language. Dog, man, runs, read, yesterday. Composite language. Language consisting of composition and structure. The dog runs, a man eats. Language with composition and non-structure, we call that nonsense. Cows the eating. Pickle eye yesterday. Nonsense. There has to be certain structure for it to make sense. Now, it's square here. So, of all things that exist, meaning all these simple concepts we can have, of all things that exist, physical and non-physical, of all things that exist, they can either be predicated or said of a subject, they can be in a subject, they can be neither predicated nor in a subject, neither in nor predicated, or they can be both in and predicated of a subject. Okay, what on earth is he talking about here? So, let's draw these 4 squares. Gonna have to get comfortable with this picture. It's not gonna go away for a while. So we can have in. You guys okay with using the symbol for not? In and not in. And then we can have predicated, or we can have not predicated. So everything that exists can fall into one of these 4 categories. Now, in and predicated, well, let's go to the next slide and get a better feel for these. I'll walk you through it on the next slide. Just note, one quick note, the way that he uses the word in modern logic is the same as predicated. So, and then when we talk about substance, we mean physical entities. Let me walk you through a first attempt at this. What does he mean, not in but predicated? When he says that something is not in but predicated, he's talking about universals whose instances are substances. Universals whose instances are physical entities. So, predicated, not in, we're talking about this. This would be things like man, chair, dog. You can talk about a man, you can talk about a chair, you can talk about a dog. These are universals whose instances are physical entities. You can talk about one of them. Next category, in and predicated. These are universals whose instances are not substances, are not physical entities. So in and predicated, here's where you have something like red. Here's where you have running. What's another example I gave? Sweet. Notice that you can't talk about a red. I can talk about a man, I can't talk about a red. Red only exists in something. Man does not only exist in something. There are instances of this, physical instances of this. There are not physical instances of this. It only exists in something. But they can be predicated of them, roughly means they're universals. Everything in this top row is going to be universals. Everything in the bottom is going to be particulars. In means it only exists in something. You can't talk about it by itself. I can't talk about a running. You want a running what? I can't talk about a 7 feet. A 7 foot what? Okay. Next we have in but not predicated. These are individual instances without any substance to them. A good example of these, in and not predicated, would be something like my memory of last week's class. My memory of last week's class, that's a particular thing. Only I have it. You can't have my memory of last week's class. But it only exists in me. If you get rid of me, you got rid of the memory. So your memories are a good example here. What else should I list as examples? Or your knowledge of the Pythagorean theorem. We're not talking about the Pythagorean theorem. We're talking about your particular knowledge or understanding of the Pythagorean theorem. That only exists in you. If I were to get rid of you, I would get rid of it. But that's a particular thing. Your individual knowledge. The Pythagorean theorem itself, that's a universal. Our knowledge of it, that's a particular thing. So these are particular entities that are not physical. And then finally, not predicated and not in, these are individual particular instances with substance. He calls them primary substances, and we'll make use of that a lot. These are your primary substances. Individual particular things. So here's universals whose instances are particular substances. That's what's in here. Universals whose instances are particular physical things. Universals whose instances have to be in something. particulars that only exist in something, and then particular physical things, actual substances. Any question on those four? Give you a second way that more professional philosophers explain it. Another way of viewing this classification is to associate predicate with universals and in with accidental. Note that when we're talking about universals, anything non-accidental would be essential. What do we mean there? Let's say that you covered me in red paint, so I am now red. You can predicate red of me. That's an accident. That's something you can also remove from me. On the other hand, being a man, you can't remove that from me. Being an animal, you can't remove that from me. Those get to my essence. I'm accidentally a teacher. I am essentially a man. I am accidentally 5'9". I am essentially an animal. So these ones are getting at essential properties. These ones are accidental properties. I can accidentally be running, but you can also stop me and then I'm not running. So these can come and go. These can sometimes be predicated of me and sometimes not predicated of me. Potentially not predicated of me. These are always predicated of me if they ever were. If you could ever say I was a man, you can always and forever say I'm a man if it's one of these essential predicates. So, not in but predicated, these are essential universals. Manness is not in James, but manness is predicated of James and will always be predicated of James, as long as James is a physical entity that exists. The only way for manness to no longer be predicated of James is to get rid of James, make him not exist as an entity anymore. I kill him and he decomposes it into something else. Okay, now you can't predicate of him anymore because he's not there anymore. But as long as he's there, it can be predicated of him. Manness is an essential universal relative to James. In and predicated. These are accidental universals. Geometry is both in me and predicated of me, accidentally. It happens to be the case I know geometry. That didn't have to be the case. Enough time could go by that I could forget the geometry right now. Or I could hit my head hard enough. Or whatever. It is a universal that can accidentally be predicated of me. In but not predicated. These are accidental particulars. I happen to possess my memory of last week's class. It wasn't essentially the case. It's accidentally the case. Not in and not predicated. These are non-accidental particulars. Me. The only way for me to not be me is to get rid of me. So what he means by in is that they have to be in some substance. What he means by by predicated is that they're universals. And that's why I said in modern logic, both in and predicated for us, in terms of modern logic, just means predicated. They're both expressed as predicates. But that's a modern logic view. Those of you not comfortable with modern logic, that's fine. But just clear up any confusion in the language. Good so far?
Yep.
When you say accidental, what you kind of mean is like a coincidence.
No.
Incidental, kind of not.
Yeah, we use this word accident different than Aristotle did. Accident is a counterpart to essential. I accidentally walked in that door. I did it with purpose, but it was accidentally the case. It didn't have to be the case.
Well,
It could have been otherwise.
Yeah, I see that all of these are just properties, and there are certain properties that we would all agree, if were removed, would destroy you actually being in that category in the first place. Being a man, for instance. Like a chair, for instance, predicate could be it's broken, but it's still a chair. But if it loses the defining feature of like being able to sit on it, then it might not be a chair.
If that's a defined feature. The better way to say it is, I can take that chair, I can make it red, then I can make it white, then I can make it blue. Then I can put cushions on it, make it a cushion chair, then I can take the cushions off and make it a non-cushion chair. But if I take a sledgehammer to it and make it not a chair anymore, okay, now it's not a chair. So those are two different things.
The only way is that however you end up defining a chair, those definitions with primary
Right, so
properties.
whatever makes it a chair is going to be over here, essential properties.
Yeah.
But its color, whether it's moving, whether it's cushioned, those types of things, those are going to be over here.
You said you just wrote primary substance. Could you actually give
Primary substance, you, me, that chair, this chalk. Any particular physical entity you can grab.
They're kind of like Plato's.
So like, I mean, are we talking down at the atomic level here? I don't understand what that means.
An atom is a primary substance. You are a primary substance. That chair is a primary substance. Chairness is up here. That particular chair is down here.
Oh, that's right.
These are instances of these.
So Johnny, for instance.
Yes. Just like object-oriented programming, you have classes and you have instances of your classes. Here's your classes, here's your instances.
Gotcha. And then it's the same across on the other side.
Kind of.
Yeah, there are instances of properties that aren't vital to the definition.
Here's your classes. If we're going to stretch the analogy, here's your types of properties you can have. Here's that property's individual particular value.
Gotcha.
Right? If I get rid of the object that has that property, I got rid of the property. And these are the types of properties that the objects can have. Okay.
Got it.
That's stretching the analogy, but I think it helps. Anything else on these four? Okay, so that's what he's going to mean when he says predicated or in. And those are words that he likes to use a lot. Now, predicated is also closely tied to Aristotle's system of classification. So we're going to have to talk about a system of classification a little bit and how he uses the word genus and species. Now, unfortunately, we already use the word genus and species in our language, and so it can be a little bit confusing. We piggyback off of what he said. So for Aristotle, genus and species are both relative terms. You could have potentially infinitely many genuses, and you could potentially have infinitely many species for you. Give you an example. So we can have a living thing. Now, right now we'll call that as a genus. So there's a genus. What's a genus? It's a collection of some things as opposed to other things. Kind of a vague definition. Collection of some things as opposed to other things. Okay, very general. It's where we get our term general, is from genus. And then from genus, I could say, now from these living things, I want to talk about the living things capable of moving, of action, which we would call animals. Or in other words, I want to talk about animated living things. So I just had this genus, and I constructed a subset with some differentiating characteristic. What's an animal? A living thing capable of independent action, or independent movement.
So that excludes plants, for instance. So, yeah.
This excludes plants. So plants are living things. Now this is some living things as opposed to others. So I stated, this now is a species relative to this. This is my genus, and I just defined a new species.
Yep. Okay.
Now I could take from animals, and I could say something along the lines of animals that give birth to live young. And we would call that a mammal. Or however it's actually defined, I don't actually know. But you get the idea. And so now this is a species relative to this genus. I took this genus and I defined something new, which gives me a species. Every definition gives you a species. So you have to start with a genus, take some differentiating characteristic to get some subset. That's what a definition is. A definition always gives you a species. Again, I could say reasoning mammals, mammals capable of reasoning, and call that man. Again, now this is a species, but this is a genus. I could have also come all the way up here, and I could have said, I want to talk about all living things capable of reasoning to define man. I could have used that as my genus to define this species.
Right.
In that sense, there could potentially be infinitely many classes between here. Maybe not really, but a lot. There isn't some predetermined finite number. And then finally, we eventually get to you. You are not a species. You are an individual thing. There is no definition of you. So with that, let's jump into this, and hopefully it makes sense. A genus is some collection of things as opposed to others. And the definition of a species consists in stating its genus and its differentiating specification. Example, animal is a genus, then man is a rational animal, or an animal is man if it's rational. There's its differentiating specification. So you state some genus, and then some differentiating specification, and that's what gives you a definition. and every definition is associated with the species. Understand, right now we're going over the first theory of definition. It is typical that in modern definitions, the species is often bold and italicized. So something you would likely see, I pulled this right out of the chemistry book, a reaction is an exothermic reaction if it liberates heat. Reaction was your genus, talk about reactions in general. We're defining now a new species, exothermic reaction, and its differentiating characteristic. It releases heat, it liberates heat. There's its definition. So we still largely use Aristotle's theory of definition for most non-rigorous texts, like chemistry, physics. Your first maths usually have these types of definitions. For example, an integer n is even. So even is our species, integer is our genus. So an integer n is even if there exists an integer k such that n is equal to 2k. Here's your differentiating specification. This is how all definitions work. Every definition takes a genus and gives you a species, according to Aristotle.
Makes sense.
Now, you can't use any differentiating specification that you want. You have to get to the essence of the thing. You have to use essential differentiating specifications. While there isn't a rule as to which genus you have to use, in defining it, you have to use the appropriate differentiating specification. It is not good enough that your definition happens to identify everything you were talking about. Going back to one of the earlier definitions of man. What was one of the earlier definitions of man? He's a featherless biped. If you have no feathers and you walk on two legs, you're a man. Now, at the time that that was uttered, it might have been the case that everything on Earth and everything in the universe that was featherless and walked on two legs happened to be a man. But as the story goes, someone comes along, plucks a chicken, and says, "Behold, man." No, it doesn't work. So there are right and wrong definitions. The definitions have to get at the essence of an object. Here's another one of those things where your opinion as to what the essence is irrelevant. Its essence is its essence. You may happen to know it, you may happen to not. A lot of how Aristotle thinks we come to understand our universe is coming to understand objects' essences. And so you try to get at whatever its actual essence is. Good so far? All right. So it is possible for a genus to also be a species, and not everything has to be a genus or a species. Like you. You are neither. Man here, in this case, is only a species. It's not a genus. Give you another example going through this training. This time I'll draw it out as subsets of each other. So we might start out with definition of a triangle. A triangle, or an equilateral triangle. So a triangle, here's our genus, is equilateral if all three sides are of equal length. So I just barely defined equilateral triangle. I don't want to write that out, so I'll just draw a picture of a triangle with all three sides of the same length. Pretend that says equilateral triangle. That is a subset of your triangles. Now, what's a triangle? A polygon, there's your genus. So now this circle is polygons. A polygon is a triangle if it has three edges and three vertices. Similarly, a plane figure is a polygon, so now here's our genus. So polygons must be a subset of plane figures. So a plane figure is a polygon if it's described by a finite number of straight line segments connected to form a closed polygonal chain. Who cares? But the point is, some differentiating specification. And so we're creating this hierarchy. This is a genus relative to this. This is a species relative to this. This is a genus relative to this. This is a species relative to this. That's what I mean by genus and species are relative. Make sense? Okay. And with that, let's go back to you for a second and ask a question. So starting with you, there you are. What are you?
Man.
You're a man. And a man is a subset of we'll just say mammals. And a mammal, all mammals are animals. And all animals are living things. And all living things are things. And all things are. Can we go back forever?
No.
Aristotle says no. And so he says that this is ultimately going to come back to one of his first of 10 categories, substance. So these are, you are a particular type of substance. Now that's why this work is called the categories. He's going to give the 10 categories that there are, that you pick any idea you have, if we trace it back through this chain, it's going to come up under one of these 10 things. And so that's what his 10 categories are. We're very familiar with his most important of his 10 categories, substance. You are a particular type of substance. Now, importantly, in this chain that we just created, from you all the way to your category, everything that's predicated of the level above is also predicated of any level below. In other words, since these all come under substance, I can call this a substance, this a substance, this a substance, this a substance, this a substance. And anything that's true for this is true for all of these. Since this is an animal, then this is an animal, this is an animal, this is an animal. And anything I can say about animals, I can say about everything down here. If I say animals are capable of moving, then man must be capable of moving. So anything that can be predicated of anything higher in the chain is also predicated of everything lower in the chain, so to speak.
But not the other way around.
But not the other way around. What's predicated of you is not necessarily predicated of men in general. Just because you have brown hair does not mean man has brown hair. But if it was the case that all men have brown hair, then you must have brown hair. If it's the case that men are mortal, then you must be mortal. Anything that's predicated of the class above you must be predicable of you. Just to give you some of the terminology, where it comes from. When something's true of a genus, we say it's generally true. When something's only true of the species, we say it's specifically true. That's where general and species come from. Are we talking about it being true of the genus or the species? That's more just fun language time. It has nothing to do with what we're saying. Did we talk about this last slide?
Yes.
How far? Yeah, so there's initial categories. So that's why it's called the categories. We're going to find 10 of these categories, and we're going to get familiar with each of these 10 categories. Don't worry, this is the only Aristotle I'll give you directly. It's just he pretty much summarizes his categories in these few sentences. So what does he say? Things said without any combination. So we're not talking about a man running. We're just talking about man, or running. Said without any combination. We're not putting a bunch of words together to get a complex idea. We're talking about a simple idea. Of things said without any combination, each signifies, each represents, each signifies either. Now he's listing out his 10 categories. Substance. We already did that one. Or quantity. Or quality, or qualification. Or a relative. Or where. Or when. Or being in a position. Sometimes it's going to come out a little bit funny. Remember, this was written in Greek, we're in English. And sometimes a Greek word, you need a lot of English words. And then sometimes you have the reverse problem. You have a lot of words where sometimes like, why don't you just say it like this? So, I understand conversion between language. So, or being in a position, or having, or doing, or being affected. So those are his 10 categories. To give a rough idea, examples of substance are man, horse. Of quantity, 4 foot, 5 foot. Of qualification, white, grammatical. Of a relative, double, half, larger. Of where? In the Lyceum, in the marketplace. Of when? Yesterday, last year. Of being in a position, is lying, is sitting. Of having, has shoes on, has armor on. Of doing, cutting, burning. Of being affected, being cut, being burned. None of the above is said just by itself in any affirmation. Affirmation being you're asserting something is true. You're affirming something to be true. None of these are affirmations. I say yesterday, true or false? Man, true or false? Doesn't make sense. So we're not talking about propositions. We're talking about language without any combination. So none of the above said just by itself is any affirmation, but by the combinations of these with one another, an affirmation is produced. If you want to build a proposition, you have to put these words together. Because we're going to be building propositions, building affirmations, building things that are either true or false. For every affirmation, it seems, is either true or false, but if things said without any combination, none is either true or false. E.g., man, white, runs, wins. Can't call them true or false. All right, there, that gives you a taste for Aristotle and how dense it is. A few sentences from his categories. So, going to go over each of these 10 categories, doing a deep dive into each of them, getting a feel for what they are. The most important of these categories is substance. Now, he takes substance and it's subdivided into two, what he calls primary substances and secondary substances. Primary substances is that which cannot be predicated of anything or be said to be in anything, or in other words, individual particulars. Going back to that square we started with, we had in, we had not in, we had predicated, and we had not predicated. Give an example in each really quick. Predicated, not in, this was something like man. These were your universals whose instances are substances. This one right here is you. We'll draw a picture there to remind you that we're not talking about the word, but actual you. In and not predicated, this would be like one of your particular memories. Memory. In and predicated, this would be like runs. Okay, so there's an example of each. So substance is subdivided into two. He's going to call these two right here substance. These two on this side are talking about actual substances in our universe. You can talk about a man and we can talk about you. We cannot talk about a runs. Can't touch it. We can't poke your memory. It's not a substance. So, substance is one of his 10 categories. And now, hopefully you understand how he describes a primary substance. That which cannot be predicated of anything or be said to be in anything. Or in other words, individual particulars, you. You're not predicated of anything and you're not in anything. You're not dependent on anything for your existence. In the same way that your memory of last week's class is dependent upon you for its existence. Okay. Secondary substances are those that can be predicated of something but still cannot be in anything. Man, animal, but not white. So that's this category. These are called secondary substances. These are called primary substances. His other 9 categories are going to have to do with things over here. So one of his 10 categories deals with these two sections of the box. So things that aren't primary substances are either predicated of the primary substances as subjects or in them as subjects. Notice that we just barely handled the two cases that are not in. These two sections over here deal with things that are in something. What are they in? They're in substances.
So why are they not species of the genus? Why isn't substance the genus?
You can have species and genuses that aren't substances. We did that with triangle. You can do that with defining numbers. So one of his categories is going to be quantity. All numbers come under quantity. Okay, good. Let's make sure that's clear. Genus and species don't necessarily only have to do with substances. They have to do with definitions in general for anything. Because remember, we were saying pick anything, look recursively at its definitions, and you're going to get back to one of these 10 categories. They're basically where you have to start with all your definitions, is what he's saying here.
But if all those definitions are dealing with things that are in, and everything that are in have to be in a substance, it feels
To exist.
To exist, right? It feels like those definitions of the stuff that's in should be able to be a subset of things that are not in of substances.
I'm losing you.
If the things that
Let's take red for an example. That would be one up here.
So, if you have a thing that's red,
Okay.
it has to exist
My
for
shirt's
something
red.
to be red,
Right.
then it feels like the definitions that pertain to red should be a subcategory of your shirt because it's a substance. red exists.
Okay, so red, we would use as its genus color in general.
Okay.
Whereas my shirt, we would use as its genus clothing. So they're going to go completely separate ways. And ultimately, my shirt's going to go back to substance. Red's going to go back to quality. Okay. But the point here is that things that aren't primary substances are either predicated of primary substances as subjects or in them as subjects. So that if the primary substances did not exist, it would be impossible for any other things to exist in this universe. That's the point there. He's trying to make it clear that he's given primacy to individual particular things, not to forms. So in other words, if you get rid of this box right here, you get rid of everything. Because these are just particular instances of these. If you get rid of all individual men, you get rid of man. Similarly, if there's no particular objects, where's all your memories at? If we get rid of all physical particular things, there's no such thing as memories. If we get rid of all individual instances, there's no running in the universe. And so these three depend upon this thing for their existence. And so this is somehow primary for everything else to exist. So it's primary substances. That's why he calls it that. Okay, so now not predicated. These are primary substances. Not in and predicated, those are secondary substances. And then finally, so when we're talking about things in that are predicated or not predicated, they have to be in something, i.e. a primary substance. So everything else exists in something. So you either have a substance, or you're talking about something that only exists in a substance. And so the other 9 categories only exist in substances. All right. Important properties of substances. They do not admit of degrees. If you and I are both men, we cannot say, you are more man than I am, or that I am more man than you are. If 2 integers are even, we cannot say that this integer is more even than that integer. Well, that was not a good example, because that's not substance. But when it comes to particular substances, they don't admit of degrees. You can't say one cat is more of a cat than another cat. You can't say one animal is more animal than another animal. Go ahead.
Isn't it, can't you say something is more animal if it fits into the definition more clearly? So for instance, you were telling me how like a featherless biped is an example where we say a man is a featherless biped, and then we go and let's say pluck this chicken. Now we got this man, and we got you man, and we can say.
So if you're able to do that, then you didn't have the definition. The definition has to get the essence of a thing. So now if you get at my essence, and you get at your essence, and you get at his essence, and we all have that same essence, then we're all equally that thing.
But you like, take for instance, we might say, okay, right, okay, and you could keep telling me it's bad definitions, and I just want to make sure that that's what we mean. So for instance, if a man has, 2 legs and 2 arms, and I'm missing a leg, would that make me less of a man?
No.
Not more.
Aristotle would say no. You having 2 legs is an accidental property. That does not get at the essence of what it means to be a man.
So it sounds like it's practically impossible, really, to come up with a correct definition of real substances, not like hypothetical mathematical. But out in reality, you really can't accurately define anything, because you could always alter it to the point that it is no longer within that definition, or
Well, then it is the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean. We have a definition of man.
if you were to
So
create-
Aristotle's definition of man is an animal capable of reasoning.
Exactly, and we've observed many animals capable of significant amount of reasoning, and also implying aliens possibly if they exist.
So if you were to go and then find aliens, then we may have a problem. But right now, based off of everything that we know, human beings are the things capable of reasoning.
What if I'm a human being that has
now we can start having that question. So if I take you as a human being and I put a bolt through your brain, are you still a man?
I'm alive.
Maybe. Remember, definition of alive now,
That's true.
in some sense, you're gone. Aristotle might say.
Right.
In some sense, you're not there anymore.
Let's say I have less capable of reasoning than a different animal. Meaning, if you were to say I still have the capability of reasoning, but an animal happens to have better reasoning than me, then that must also be a man.
You're viewing it as though, look, are you capable of doing geometry? Can I still teach you geometry?
If I'm capable, yeah.
Okay. I cannot teach a chimpanzee geometry.
Okay.
Okay.
So if I lose the ability for you to teach me geometry,
If it
I no
now
longer
gets
am
to the
man.
point where you take so much brain damage that that is now an impossible thing for you to do, then in some sense, you are gone. In some sense, we have destroyed you. In some sense, you are no longer a man.
Great. So that's my point. Is there is no such thing as a perfect definition because that wouldn't work. 'Cause I am still a
Aristotle
man.
would say there is no way for us to know for sure that we have the perfect definition, but he would say there is for sure the perfect definition. Because we can for sure come to know these things. Look, start with a basic fact that you're aware of. I can sit here, I can go find 100 chairs out there that you guys have never seen before. And yet, I can pull them out one at a time and have you all correctly classify them as chairs. There is some essential nature that those things do have that you are able to identify.
And if we were
Not really. What we do is our entire lives is look at things that we identify.
Is this a
Pick up-
chair?
Pick up common.
Exactly.
features.
You pick up on these commonalities that exist in those things.
Yep. And then
So that commonality, whatever that is, that commonality, that exists in those things. And so you choose some combination of letters to apply to it. Doesn't matter what combinations of letters you choose to apply to it. But once you give it a name, that name is talking about some essential thing. And now you might realize that we're talking about different things. I might teach my child, that's a dog, that's a dog, that's a dog. And then one day they see a sheep and they think that's a dog because they think every animal is a dog. And I need to work with them and say, no, not a dog, and re-scope down what exactly it is, the essential thing we're getting at with that word. But there is something there. And so that's why we're able to talk about these things. And if I were to go around and have you each identify all the objects in this room, you somehow all agree. You can all call that a piece of chalk and that a marker.
doesn't matter how much we agree though.
But why do you agree? It's not some weird mystical accident that we're all agreeing.
Right.
It's because there is some actual form that exists in that thing that you and I and her and them can all agree upon.
Well, it's agreeable because it's useful. It's useful to categorize things to the point.
Something doesn't exist just because it's useful.
We define things.
We happen
and
to make
categorize
use of things that exist.
Right.
First it exists, then we get use out of it. It's not, we get use out of it, so we make it exist.
Something exists. Sorry. Say it again. You got to turn around. I realize we're in the middle of class. But
All right. So substances don't emit degrees. If something fits the definition of man, it fits the definition of man. You can argue, do you have the perfect definition of man? Blah, blah, blah. Okay. But if something fits the definition of man, something fits the definition of man. As that you and I both fit the definition of man, then there is no way that we can argue that you are more of a man than I am, or that I am more of a man than you are. I mean, what you're looking at is a philosophical framework for talking about natural rights. All men have the same rights. Why? Because you're all equally man. That's why. This is completely different from Socrates, who says, I'm more manless than you. I'm more of a man than you because I represent the form better. And you are less than me. And how do I know that I'm more of it than you? Well, I think I'm more courageous than you are, or whatever the virtue is.
definition of a man. Theory to him. In his mind.
Well, understand, Aristotle is the first one setting up this system of definition.
So, okay, so Aristotle, when he categorizes, he's saying, look, it's black and white. You either are in it or you are not in this category.
No, Aristotle always understands that there's corner cases. And he says the fact that there's these weird cases doesn't mean we should ignore the obvious cases. So he was a biologist. He said, it's hard for me to tell with some of these things whether it's a living thing or not. That doesn't change the fact that obviously a rock is not, and obviously a leopard is. So there are black and white cases. Just because there are some bored or confusing cases doesn't mean we should throw the system out and say, nope, the system doesn't work. The fact that we can recognize obvious differences means that there's something to it. It's obvious to us. And whether there's some weird corner cases is irrelevant. Those happen to come up hardly ever. And so, yes, we can keep working with our definition and we realize, uh-oh, platypuses lay eggs. What do we say? Throw the whole system out? No. A duck is still obviously a bird, and a leopard is still obviously a mammal. And now let's work with the platypus case.
Yeah, so the more we, and of course everyone has slightly different definition in their mind, but if you and I were trying to come up with absolute unity, where you could present every single object to us in the entire universe, we would be able to accurately determine which ones are the man, which ones are not, and there would be no confusion whatsoever. And that
So
would be,
completely being able to classify, in Aristotle's mind, would mean that you are now omniscient. That is what knowing something's definition is, knowing the object. That's what it means to come to know it. And so what you're talking about is something we should strive for in the sciences. Whether in the sciences we can practically come to know everything, that's a different question. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
yes, and so we over time, as more knowledge and understanding and niche cases come into view, we refine our definitions until they fit into the category we want them to fit into.
Well, kind of. Not that we want them to fit into. Look, however we define man has to include you and me. I'm going to say I don't want to include partly and come up with some weird thing that excludes you and gets everyone else.
Literally cut it.
No, because it wouldn't be getting at an essence anymore.
It's accurately as valid to do that.
No, it's not. You're
just
missing-
saying that because you just, this could go on.
Because then she would be confused. She's not confused when I say you are a man. It's the fact that all human beings can agree upon this thing that tells you that there's something to it.
Not necessarily. I don't.
Of course it does.
Just because the entire human race.
Just because the entire human race agrees upon something doesn't necessarily make it true,
Yeah,
but it
yeah,
consistently working is a foundation of inductive reasoning. Is it necessarily the case that this is going to fall when I let go? No. I could have rigged it up so that there's some metal in there and there's a magnet in the ceiling and let go and it shoots up. So yes, you can always come up with the corner case, but the generalization is it's going to fall. And that's still a valid generalization because in general it works. Look, when you get to the sciences, all truths are probabilistic. There's no such thing as certainty.
Right.
So if it works in the majority of cases, it's what we call true. So you sitting here saying, well, Aristotle, based off your definition, it excludes this one thing over here that I think should be included as man. Aristotle says, who cares? It's working.
It's working.
And maybe there's something that can be discovered there, and maybe we can look into that. But it's working. We're onto something.
So.
And that's why everyone can do this. I show my daughter a few instances of men, and for some reason, that's enough for her to go and start mass classifying. It's amazing. Because there's actually something there. So says Aristotle. And if it was just completely arbitrary, and I says, nope, the reason I called them men is because they were 6'3", had brown hair, da-da-da.
I think that for this to be
If it wasn't getting at its essential thing, it wasn't getting at forms that you could actually identify in that person through your personal experience, then it's not getting to its essence.
Yes, and the only reason why, for instance, your daughter or anyone, or even him, Aristotle would give a damn about categorizing things is it helps us make decisions based off
Well,
of that.
you don't get to say why someone does something. All you can say is that they do it. And for some reason, we are identifying them based off of the same things. I didn't tell her how to differentiate which is a man. I just simply told her man, man, man. And there's some form that those things have in common that she was able to take in and understand. I didn't tell her the definition of a chair. I showed her chair, chair, chair. And she's able to take in that form and understand. And I can show her new things and she can say chair, chair, chair. So being exposed to it, she's getting to some essential characteristics, some essential form. There's something real there that she's taken in. And so it's crazy that I can show her just these few chairs, you can show your daughter just these few chairs, and yet they suddenly agree on all these chairs. Now there may still be weird corner cases that they come and they disagree about, but look how general they understand what chair means based off seeing a few instances. No telling them definitions. They're seeing some form that's common to all of them. And they're taking it in and they're understanding it. They're seeing some essential nature. Now, whether they perfectly see it, whether there's some confusions about what exactly that essence is, there must be something to it. It works too well. It's crazy.
I'm just gonna have to disagree on that. I don't think that we're coming to some truth just because everyone agrees or feels that there's something there. That doesn't mean there must be. It doesn't mean we could define things based off of.
We can define however we want.
The way we would define things is all the way down to the atomic level, if not even less, and say, well, if it's 20 atomic levels this way and 20 atoms this high, then this is the definition. But if it's one extra atom, then it's a completely different category, and you can create trillions and infinite amounts of categorizations to define every last little single aspect of variance down to the atomic level and even less, and it would be a way to categorize. And
Okay.
we super generalize situations, generalize what man, generalize it.
Well, still, your system doesn't work because it doesn't include things that aren't physical. Even if you get down to the atom, it doesn't separate a living person from a dead person. I can have the identical atoms, and it doesn't work.
But I said atom, but
I know what you mean, but
because
yes.
it's the smallest object that one of the small. We now know they're smaller, and that there's not things that aren't atoms, photons. There's all different types of things. My point is if we were to break it down to the smallest molecule that does exist in the universe, wherever it is, which I highly doubt we found, that could be the categorization of its form and its space, time and space, and its shape. And you can make infinite amounts of categorizations that way.
Okay.
And my point is that there's no reason to categorize it in that detailed or that broad, except for the fact that it's useful for us as humans to simply generalize something so that we know how to treat it or interact around it.
Okay.
That's all I can think of.
All right. So, a substance, still, who's more of a man, you or me? Is there a way to determine that? Some objective way to determine that? You, me, or Bob?
You could include the definition as being more variable.
Is there a way to do that?
There could be some type of analog.
We could make up something that does it, but is there a way objectively to do that? Aristotle says no.
Okay.
So you can't say one man is more man than another man, taking it to a mathematical level. You can't say one triangle is more triangle than another triangle. Yes, we can redefine triangle, so that one is and one isn't, da 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 da. But based off the definition of triangle, they're both triangles. One's
Right.
equilateral, one's isosceles.
Yes.
And you can't say one is different from another,
Yes, if it fits in the category it is, period. If
Right.
It doesn't.
right?
Got it.
Perfect. Now, I could have done something like this, and now you're a little confused. Was I going for a triangle there? Was I not? It doesn't change the fact that obviously we were talking about triangles here.
It's funny because as a human, I can
Right.
say maybe that is a triangle.
Right, that's my
even
point.
though it doesn't even make the definition.
So
of a triangle.
obviously this wasn't. Obviously this was. Now we're getting iffy.
So you can say that's more triangleness and that's less triangleness.
Right, but assuming my drawing wasn't awful, this is a triangle, this is a triangle. And just because we have the weird cases where we're not sure how to classify it, when we know how to classify it, one is not more than the other.
You could find out if you were to.
Once we classify it, so now it's classified. Come up with whatever system of classification you want. Now two things are classified. And they're both in that system. However you come up with it, do all your crazy atom counting that you want. If they're both in the same category, you can't say one is more, belongs to that category more than the other. Once you got them in a category. Once you call it a particular type of substance, however you come up with your categories, and whatever that category is what that category is. Okay. So, substances do not admit of degrees. All things in that category are equally in that category. If it fits the definition, it fits the
I
definition.
think it's a fair way to define it.
All men are equally man. Foundation for human rights.
Okay.
Can't say one human by nature deserves more rights than another. Substances also do not admit of contraries, meaning like opposites. What's the contrary of white? What's the opposite of white? The color? Black. What's contrary of good? Bad. What's contrary of tall? Small. What's contrary of me? There isn't one. So substances also don't admit of contraries. So he's given us keys, things that you can look for to identify what category something ultimately falls in. So here's the things with substances. They don't admit of degrees, and they don't admit of contraries. It is also distinctive of substances that what is numerically one and the same is able to receive contraries. In other words, at one moment I can be sick, at another moment I can be healthy. At one moment I can be white, at another moment I can be black. Changing my color, or a chair. Chair at one moment can be white, one moment can be black. At one moment I can be good, at one moment I can be bad. Only substances can admit of contraries. White can never be black. White is white. You can't ever make white into its contrary. You can't ever make it have a contrary. So only substances admit of contraries. Maybe we'll leave it with substances, restart there next time, and go over the 10 categories. All right, so we'll end it there.